Hello, so what I'm going to do, well, there you are. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to do some exploratory testing of a REST API. This is a REST API that I've written, so in theory, I should know how it works. But what I'm going to do is, based on the documentation that I've written, I'm going to explore this REST API. I'm going to use a couple of tools. I'll probably have a proxy. I'll use Postman. I'm going to make some notes. But this is the first time I'm really starting to test my API. As I've been building the code, I've written quite a lot of unit tests and integration tests. They're all in here. There's quite a few of them. So I'm fairly confident it basically works. I know some of the problems that it has. I have coded in some deliberate bugs in here, but the system is running with those deliberate bugs fixed. So in theory, I shouldn't find any bugs, but this is less a session about finding bugs and more just about general how do you test an API. So it's running locally. The API is running on port 4567. One of the first things I can do with this API is a heartbeat. This is mentioned in the documentation. Let's have a look. So one of the endpoints here is /heartbeat, and it returns a 200 to indicate that the server is running. And I can immediately see that in the markdown rendering for this, that is not particularly good. Why is that? That's better. So my markdown had a bug in it. Let's fix that. So I'm not planning on fixing many bugs as I go through, but I will fix some documentation bugs as I go through if it's obvious. In a browser, the only request I can really do is a GET request. I mean, it's not strictly true. There's plugins I can use to do that. But a GET request is essentially what I have here. I have no visibility into the request here. What I can do is if I go into the network tab, make that request again, I can then see the actual response. This response has no data, but it's got some headers. There's the request, there's the response headers. So I can start to get more visibility into what's going on. Because one of the issues we have when testing a REST API is we need to get a lot of visibility into how the system works. We're also trying to observe the traffic that's going through. We need to manipulate the traffic at a lower level. I really want to push requests not from a browser, but from a tool that lets me do post requests, get requests, put requests, delete requests. So I'm going to start up Postman to do this. Ooh, version 5. Haven't used version 5. Software only updates when you're trying to do a demo. Okay, we're good, we're in. Now you can see that I've started doing a little bit of testing here. This is my REST core system. I'm going to rename that because I've changed this. This is my REST listicator, because all this REST API does really is let you manage lists. And it doesn't even let you manage lists. It lets you create lists and delete things, but not put things in a list. So eventually this will become a to-do list manager type application. So looking in the documentation, Postman is fine, it's letting me send requests, but what I really want is visibility into the actual request that's sent. At the moment, I'm not completely convinced that I'm sending the right request in. So I'm going to start Postman up to go through a proxy. So let me start a proxy. What will we use? Let's use Zap. So at this point, I basically spend the next 20 minutes trying to get Postman working through a proxy. It used to be that I could just do -- proxy-server at the command line. Postman would pop through a proxy. Couldn't get that working in version 5.0 something or in version 5.1.1. I found a settings option in proxy 5.1.1 which says use the default system proxy, which means I then moved over to Fiddler, because on Windows Fiddler hooks in and becomes your system proxy, and it's very easy to use, and Postman pointed through that. So I think Postman has changed over the last couple of releases. Putting it through a proxy, it no longer works in this hack fashion. I don't know what the official way of changing Postman to point to a proxy port is, but Postman will hook into the system proxy, so that's a workaround at the moment. And that cost me 20-25 minutes in this video that I've just edited out for you. Okay, so I'm not sure what happened there. Postman no longer seemed to be working with the proxy settings. I don't know why. I'm not going to investigate it at this point. The way that I've got this working is in Postman, there's a proxy settings in here that says use the system's default proxy configurations. Great. Fiddler, and if you're on a Mac, Charles does the same thing. It takes over as your default proxy. So I've managed, by using Fiddler, which hooks in and pretends to be the default proxy, Postman will by default will now use this proxy. I can send a heartbeat request and it will show up in here. So I've got Fiddler going through a proxy. By default, I need to figure out why Postman isn't going through a proxy anymore. Clearly something has changed since the last time I used it. But this is good enough for the moment. Sometimes we have to fiddle. Now that took me, I don't know, 10 minutes. So I've gone over that fast. But we're good to go. So I have Postman. It is going through a proxy. I can now see the actual heartbeat request. If I look at it in raw, there's the request that's going through. Here's the response. I can see the actual back and forward of the messaging. That's what I need. Now I'm ready to test this API. So what does the documentation tell me? The documentation tells me I can do a get on lists. I have a lists endpoint. So in here, Postman, I've got a lists endpoint send. Now the perceptive in you there will have noticed that this isn't localhost, this is 127.0.0.1, which is essentially the same thing. Localhost and 127.0.1 are pretty much the same thing. So when I issue a get request on lists, I can see that the system has no lists. And we've got back JSON there. In the message, I didn't specify JSON. I said I will accept anything, but it sent back JSON. So by default, we're getting JSON back from the application. In the documentation, it says that if I put in a header application XML for accept, then I should see XML coming back. So if I start typing in here, accept, there's the accept header value XML, send that request through, and we've got the response back in XML. Ooh. So the REST API is responding to the different headers. Let's just double check that it's accepting JSON. It says it does. By default, it was doing that. I will check by putting the header in here. Send that list. There we go. Now, I'm not making a lot of notes when I'm testing, and the reason for that is that my notes are here, right? And I'm recording it. If I wasn't, I'd be making a lot of notes as to what's going on. In fact, I should make a note. So I need to investigate why that is now harder than it was, and it was hard enough before. If I only can use the system default proxy, then that limits me in some ways, but I can still bypass that by using Fiddler or Charles. So I've got a workaround, but I like to be able to specify the proxy that I want, so I need to investigate why that's happening. Right, but back to the API. So we've got a list endpoint. I can post to this and presumably create a list. The format for post isn't here, so I'm going to base it on this. Now you can see here I've got a documentation problem. I've got a documentation problem that the REST API documentation isn't brilliant, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this example here. Since this is the lists endpoint, I'm going to create a new thing here. I'll call this save as create lists. I'll call this JSON. Put this in the listigator. So I need to post to lists in the body raw. I'm going to post as JSON, so that means the content type. Oops. Should really be application/JSON. So now I'm specifying I will accept JSON in the response. I will send you JSON as the content type. The body that I'm going to send is that. I'll take out the GUID so that the system can create that automatically for me. I'm going to take out the created date and amended date. I don't want to enforce that. I don't even know if it will. So I'll just do something basic that I think should work. So that is a malformed array of lists. Did I copy paste that from the documentation? Yes, I did. So that's an error in there. So what that was saying is, I want to send in an object, which is an array called lists, which has these objects in it. But I hadn't terminated the JSON at the back. So we can see that there's a syntax error in here. So I need to add that. Syntax error goes away. I don't want to send in malformed JSON. So let's send in post request to list with this and see what happens. So it says 401 unauthorized. Does the documentation mention that? There it doesn't mention authorization. So it does in the individual GUID, but it doesn't there. So I need to amend the documentation. I can do that directly in the documentation here. Now, unfortunately, I know what the authorized users are. So let me, and I know that in this particular application, I can authenticate in a couple of different ways. So I can do authorization based on basic auth. So I'm going to do that. And I will do a normal user. I can't remember if a normal user can create a list or not. So let's send that. So a normal user can. So we've got a 201 created and it's come back in JSON because that's what we asked for. Tell me we've created something with a title, with a description, with the created date and amended date and a GUID. So we've actually managed to create something through here. What I'm going to try, since I've got something here in XML, I'm going to use that. Let me do a save as, create lists XML, list care, save. So this headers is going to be, I will give you content type XML. We're authenticated in the body. I keep doing that, but I'm sending request, creating requests. I keep trying to edit the response. What I need to edit is the thing going in. There we go. List again. I will take out the GUID. Leave the description and title. I'll put a description in this time. I don't think title needs to be unique because we've got a GUID. That's probably okay. Let me save that, then send that. 201 created, and it's come back as JSON, which is what we asked for. So if I say accept XML and send that, then we have XML. So I know that earlier on we tried to do get lists and that was an empty array back. So here, this should be all the lists that we've created, but this is not easy to read here. So it's in pretty print mode in Postman, but that's JSON. So let's do that. So now I can see that I've created 3 lists in here. Yes, and I sent in 2 with the hello. That confused me for a second. There we go. And that, children or adults or grown-ups or whoever's watching it, is a good reason why we should vary the test data when we put in a new entity every time. If I had changed the test data, that wouldn't have been confusing for me. For example, instead of going post title hello, if I'd gone title and then used the description to describe the test that I'd sent in, like sent this using XML, expecting XML in return, that would have been much more useful for me as a tester. Always remember to adjust your test data that you send in to support your testing and your review. Right, so in this get, I will now change the headers to accept, or to give me back. So I will accept XML. Send, and we've got XML back and it's encoded. Okay, right, so because I had issues setting up Postman, this take me longer than I expected, but I've done some exploratory testing. This has been useful to me because I have fixed some documentation issues. I have found another investigation that I have to do with Postman to figure out why its proxy isn't working, but At the moment, workaround for proxies in Postman is to use the default proxy, which means Fiddler on Windows because it hooks in nice and easily, and Charles on Mac because that should hook in. I haven't tested this on Mac, this is just the theory, but use your system proxy for the moment until we figure out how to change Postman to use whatever proxy we need. So you've seen me do some basic REST requests on a web service using Postman. You've seen me save requests, you've seen me adjust the content type to send in JSON or XML. Presumably it's validating that. I should check. In fact, I'll do that later. There's a whole bunch of things we could do when we test and we explore, and we use Postman to explore the different verbs. Make sure that when I do a link option, I should get a 405 back. 405, method not allowed, test succeeded. All right, Postman is a great way for letting us explore around the things that we haven't already done in the automated test execution, but you really want to push it through a proxy to get visibility so you can see the actual things coming back. Errors are a lot easier to spot because they get flagged up in Fiddler as a red. That's a 400 error. That's a red. It's a 400 thing. Now, in theory, I might want to see an error message in here. The system doesn't do that. I can investigate it, but this gives me a chance to explore it. Hopefully that's a useful, quick example of how to use these tools in combination to support your exploratory testing of REST APIs. And remember to subscribe for more videos like this. Or better. Better. Come on.